You'll fly economy, Mom. Ethan and I are in business class. My daughter said it so casually, you would think she was asking me to pass the salt. We were standing at the airport check-in counter, surrounded by the low hum of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements, and for a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard her. "Excuse me?" I asked. Caroline didn't even look embarrassed. She adjusted the strap of her designer handbag, something Italian with a polished brass clasp I recognized from a boutique on Madison Avenue, and glanced at the boarding passes in her hand. "It's just easier this way," she said. "Ethan booked everything already. Business only had 2 seats left." Easier. Those 2 seats, I should mention, were paid for with my credit card. "Hello, everyone. Grace here." When I first read this moment, I had to pause. Some insults are loud. Others are quiet and polished like this one. Tell me honestly, how many of you have seen family treat someone like this once they think they're no longer in charge? Now, at 74 years old, I am not a fragile woman. I have managed property leases, negotiated contracts with men who thought a silver-haired woman wouldn't understand numbers, and once spent 3 hours arguing with a customs officer in Marseille over a misplaced crate of Limoges porcelain. I do not cry easily, but something about the way Caroline said it made the air feel thinner. Behind the counter, the airline agent, a young man with careful hair and a perfectly tied navy tie, looked up from his screen, his eyes flicking briefly between us. Even he could sense the awkwardness settling over the counter, like dust. "You'll still be on the same flight?" Caroline continued, as if explaining something to a child. "It's only a few hours." Only a few hours. I looked at the boarding pass she handed me. Economy. Seat 38B. A middle seat. Across the counter, Ethan gave me a polite smile, the kind of smile people practice in mirrors before networking events. He had the calm expression of a man who believed everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "Travel's so crowded these days," he added smoothly. "Hard to get good seats last minute." Last minute. The trip had been planned for 3 months. In fact, I had written the check for the hotel deposit myself. A lovely place on the coast outside Barcelona. Old stone walls, sea views, a restaurant famous for its saffron paella and razor-thin jamón ibérico. Caroline had insisted we all go together. A family reconnection, she called it. She had sounded almost sweet on the phone. "You deserve a vacation too, Mom," she'd said. Funny how generous people become with your money. I studied her face now. Caroline looked immaculate as always. Cream wool coat, perfectly styled hair, sunglasses perched on her head, though we were indoors. She had the same composed expression she used when speaking to waiters or real estate agents. Efficient, controlled, distant. For a moment, I wondered if she even realized what she had said. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice slightly. "Mom, please don't make a scene," she murmured. "It's just a seat." Just a seat. The phrase slid through me like cold water. Behind us, a man pulling a suitcase slowed slightly, clearly listening. The airport smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, the bright sound echoing through the terminal. And there I stood, holding a boarding pass that felt strangely unfamiliar in my hands. Seat 38B. I thought about the last 10 years, the tuition payments for Lucas's private school, the temporary loan when Ethan's investment project collapsed, the down payment I quietly covered when Caroline bought their condo overlooking the river. Each time it had been presented as a small favor, a little help. Family helps family. I had believed that. I looked at Ethan again. He was scrolling through his phone now, completely relaxed. Caroline was already turning back toward the counter agent. "Can we check these bags to Barcelona?" she asked briskly. The young man nodded and began typing. 2 large suitcases rolled onto the scale. I recognized them immediately. They were mine. I had bought them for Caroline 3 Christmases ago. Italian leather, deep burgundy color, the kind that ages beautifully if you care for it. The agent printed 2 luggage tags and attached them to the handles. "Business class priority," he said politely. Of course. Caroline didn't even glance at me as she collected the tags. "Mom, your boarding group is probably later," she added casually. "Just meet us there after you board." Meet us there, as if we were strangers on the same bus. Something quiet shifted inside me then. Not anger exactly. Something older, heavier. Clarity. I looked again at the boarding pass in my hand. 38B. And suddenly, I understood something that should have been obvious long ago. This trip was never about family. It was about my wallet and my silence. I lifted my eyes slowly and said the only thing that came to mind. "Caroline," I asked gently, "who paid for this flight?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "Well, you did, technically," she admitted. "But Ethan handled the booking." Ethan finally looked up from his phone. I smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile a woman gives when she has just made a decision. And for the first time that morning, I stepped away from the check-in counter. I did not walk far. Just a few steps away from the counter, far enough that Caroline and Ethan would have to raise their voices if they wanted my attention. The airport floor gleamed under the white terminal lights, polished so thoroughly it reflected the movement of people rushing toward their gates. For a moment, I simply stood there, holding the boarding pass between my fingers. Seat 38B. I had flown enough in my life to know exactly what that meant. 3 seats pressed together like library books on a shelf. Someone's elbow inevitably claiming the armrest. A stranger climbing over your knees halfway through the flight to use the restroom. 8 hours breathing recycled air and pretending not to notice the person beside you watching a loud action film without headphones. Economy. I turned the paper over slowly. Barcelona. 3 months ago, when Caroline suggested the trip, she had sounded almost affectionate. I remember the call clearly. I had been sitting in my kitchen with a cup of Darjeeling tea and a slice of almond torte from the bakery on Lexington. "You should come with us, Mom," she had said. "It'll be good for Lucas, too. A proper family vacation." Lucas had been the only reason I agreed. My grandson had always been different from the rest of them. Quieter, kinder. When he visited, he asked questions about my old travels, about the porcelain figurines in my cabinet, about the strange brass astrolabe I kept on the bookshelf from a market in Istanbul. Children notice things adults pretend not to see. I glanced back toward the check-in counter. Caroline was laughing at something Ethan said while the airline agent finished tagging their luggage. The burgundy suitcases, my gift, sat upright beside them like obedient servants. Neither of them had noticed I was gone. That realization settled into my chest with surprising weight, not even a glance. I walked toward a row of tall windows overlooking the runway. Outside, planes moved slowly across the tarmac like enormous silver animals. A baggage cart rattled past below, its yellow lights blinking. Airports have always fascinated me. Everyone believes they're beginning something important. A new place. A new story. But sometimes the most important decision happens before the flight even leaves the ground. I slipped my phone out of my handbag. For several seconds, I simply looked at the screen. Then I opened my banking app. People often assume women my age struggle with technology. I find that amusing. When you've spent 30 years managing property accounts and lease contracts, a mobile banking interface is hardly intimidating. Within a minute, I located the transaction. Airline booking. 3 passengers. The amount made me raise an eyebrow. Ethan had clearly enjoyed himself while selecting those last-minute business class seats. Interesting. My thumb hovered briefly over the options. Modify booking. Cancel passenger. I glanced over my shoulder. Caroline and Ethan were still at the counter, now discussing something with the agent about priority boarding. They looked perfectly comfortable, perfectly confident. They believed the situation was settled. I felt something quiet and steady settle into place inside me. Not anger, control. Across the terminal, a cafe grinder whirred loudly, filling the air with the rich smell of fresh espresso. Somewhere nearby, a woman argued into her phone in rapid French. A child dragged a plush giraffe along the floor by one leg. Life continued moving in 1,000 small directions. And for the first time since arriving at the airport, I allowed myself a small, thoughtful smile. Because Caroline had just made a mistake. A very expensive one. I stood by the tall airport window with my phone in my hand, watching a plane slowly reverse from the gate while the banking app remained open on the screen. The transaction sat there quietly, a neat digital record of generosity I had offered without hesitation 3 months earlier. 3 passengers. New York to Barcelona. Total cost. Far more than most people would consider reasonable for a flight. Ethan clearly had expensive tastes when someone else was paying. I tapped the booking details again. The airline system opened the reservation page connected to the purchase. Everything was neatly organized. Names, seats, baggage priority, meal preferences. Caroline Whitmore, business class. Ethan Whitmore, business class. Evelyn Carter, economy. I almost laughed. Not loudly. Just the kind of quiet breath a person releases when something finally becomes too obvious to ignore. A middle seat, after everything. I lifted my eyes again toward the check-in counter. Caroline was leaning against it now, scrolling through her phone with bored impatience. Ethan was speaking to the airline agent about lounge access. His tone had that confident smoothness he used whenever he assumed doors would open for him. Perhaps they usually did. They certainly had when my credit card was involved. My thumb hovered over the screen again. Modify reservation. The airline's interface loaded slowly, as if giving me time to reconsider. A list of options appeared beneath the booking information. Change seat. Upgrade passenger. Cancel passenger. For a brief moment, an old habit tried to speak inside my head. Let it go, Evelyn. It's just a flight. Don't cause problems. I had heard that voice many times before. It had convinced me to wire money when Ethan's investment opportunity collapsed 2 years ago. It had persuaded me to help with the down payment on Caroline's condo overlooking the river. It had even justified paying Lucas's private school tuition because, as Caroline once put it, good schools open good doors. Each time I told myself the same thing. Family helps family. But families, I had begun to realize, were not supposed to treat generosity like a permanent resource. I tapped Cancel Passenger. The system asked which one. 3 names appeared: Caroline, Ethan, Evelyn. I studied the screen calmly. Then I selected Caroline Whitmore. The confirmation window appeared immediately. Cancel this passenger's ticket. This action will remove the traveler from the booking. My finger rested on the button. Across the terminal, the boarding announcement for another flight echoed through the hall. A group of travelers rushed past me pulling suitcases that rattled across the polished floor. Everything felt strangely peaceful. For 74 years, I had tried to keep the balance in my family, to smooth tensions, to help quietly, to avoid unpleasant scenes. But Caroline had said something important a few minutes earlier. Don't make a scene. I smiled again at the thought, because canceling a ticket from a distance without raising my voice, without even returning to the counter, that wasn't a scene at all. That was administration. I pressed confirm. The screen refreshed. Caroline Whitmore. Ticket canceled. For a few seconds, nothing happened around me. The airport continued its endless rhythm of movement and announcements. No alarms sounded, no lights flashed. But at the check-in counter, I suddenly noticed movement. Caroline's phone lit up in her hand. She frowned. Then she looked at Ethan, and a few seconds later, both of them turned around, scanning the terminal, looking for me. I watched them notice. First, Caroline looked down at her phone with mild irritation, the way people do when an airline notification interrupts their day. Her eyebrows pulled together slightly as she read the message. Then she tapped the screen once, twice. Her expression changed. "Ethan," she said, not loudly, just sharp enough that he stopped talking to the airline agent. "What?" he asked, still relaxed. Caroline turned the phone toward him. I could see the moment he understood. His posture stiffened almost immediately, the smooth confidence draining from his face like someone had pulled a plug. "That can't be right," he muttered. The airline agent looked up politely. "Is there a problem?" Caroline forced a thin smile. "Just a second." Her eyes began scanning the terminal, and then they found me, standing near the tall windows with the planes behind me. For a moment, she looked almost confused, as if the distance between us had created a small gap in reality she needed to correct. Then she started walking, not rushing. Caroline never rushed. She moved with the same controlled pace she used when entering a restaurant she believed was beneath her expectations. Ethan followed 2 steps behind. By the time they reached me, Caroline's smile had disappeared entirely. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. I tilted my head slightly. "Good morning to you too." "My ticket was canceled," she said. "I just got a notification." "Yes," I replied calmly. "I imagine you did." Ethan folded his arms. "Evelyn, there must be some mistake." "There isn't." Carolyn stared at me as if trying to determine whether I was joking. "You canceled my seat?" she asked. I looked down briefly at the boarding pass still in my hand. "Seat 38B. "That's correct." Her voice rose half a level. "Why would you do that?" The question hung between us in the bright airport light. Why? Such a curious word when the answer had been given 10 minutes earlier at the check-in counter. "You said business class only had 2 seats," I reminded her gently. "Yes," she said impatiently. "Exactly. And you suggested I fly economy." "That's not the point," Caroline snapped. "The point is you just removed me from the flight." Ethan stepped forward slightly, trying to recover control of the conversation. "Evelyn," he said in his practiced, reasonable tone. "This isn't really funny. The flight board's soon. We just need to reinstate the ticket." Reinstate. Such a confident word. I slipped my phone back into my handbag. "I'm afraid that won't be necessary." Caroline blinked. "What?" "I won't be boarding either." For the first time since they approached me, both of them fell completely silent. Behind us, another boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. A group of passengers hurried toward a nearby gate, their suitcases rattling loudly across the floor. Caroline stared at me as if trying to process a language she didn't speak. You're not going? She said slowly. No. But the hotel is booked. Yes. The transfers are arranged. Yes. The dinner reservation at that place Ethan found, also booked. Her voice sharpened again. Then what exactly are you doing? I met her eyes calmly. Going home. The words seemed to land harder than anything else I had said. Ethan looked genuinely unsettled now. His carefully managed composure had developed small cracks. Evelyn, he said carefully, this trip was your idea. I almost laughed at that. No, I said softly. It wasn't. Caroline's frustration finally broke through her polished exterior. You cannot just walk away and leave us here, she said. I raised an eyebrow. Caroline, I replied, that is exactly what you were planning to do to me. Only your version involved seat 38B. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Then I adjusted the strap of my handbag and glanced toward the terminal exit. I suggest you speak to the airline desk, I added politely. They may still have seats available. Caroline's voice followed me immediately. Mom. I paused. It had been a long time since she used that word without calculation. But when I turned back, I realized something interesting. She wasn't asking. She was panicking. Panic is an interesting thing to watch when it appears in someone who usually lives above consequences. Caroline had always been very good at control. She controlled rooms, conversations, impressions. At dinner parties, she could redirect a topic with a single sentence. At charity events, she spoke as if she had been born on a stage. Even at home, when Lucas was younger, she ran the household like a quiet executive. But panic made small cracks appear. Mom, she repeated, walking closer. Don't do this. Her voice had changed now, softer, but tighter. Ethan stepped in quickly, attempting to smooth the situation before it spiraled further. Let's just slow down a second, he said calmly. We can fix this. I studied him with mild curiosity. Ethan Whitmore was a very composed man when things were going his way. Tall, polished, always dressed like someone who expected to be taken seriously in any room he entered. The kind of man who liked to mention market trends during dinner and casually reference investment terms like portfolio diversification and asset rotation. 2 years ago, when one of his ventures collapsed, he had come to my house looking exactly the same. Calm, polished, reasonable, until he asked for $200,000. Evelyn, he continued now, spreading his hands slightly, in that diplomatic gesture people use when pretending everything is still normal. The airline system probably just flagged the payment or something. If you call them, we can restore the reservation. No, I said. It was a very small word. But it stopped him immediately. Caroline stared at me. What do you mean, no? I mean, I said evenly, your ticket has been canceled. You can't just cancel my flight, she said. I already did. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. All right, he said. Then we'll just purchase another one. That would be sensible. Caroline blinked at me again. You're serious? Yes. The silence between us stretched for several seconds. Behind us, the airport continued moving in its endless rhythm. A group of college students walked past, laughing loudly. Someone dropped a metal water bottle that clanged across the floor. A loudspeaker announced boarding for a flight to Lisbon. None of it seemed to touch the small storm forming between the three of us. Caroline's voice hardened again. You're doing this because of the seat. No, I replied. Then why? I looked at her carefully. The answer was simple. But simple answers are often the hardest ones for people to hear. I'm doing this, I said quietly, Because you expected me to accept it. Caroline shook her head in disbelief. This is ridiculous. Is it? Yes, she snapped. It's a seat on a plane, Mom. You're acting like a child. That word hung in the air for a moment. Child. Strange accusation to make toward a 74-year-old woman who had been paying your bills for half a decade. Ethan stepped forward again. Look, he said, lowering his voice slightly. We're wasting time standing here. The flight board's in 40 minutes. Caroline, let's just go to the desk and rebook your ticket. With what card? I asked calmly. That stopped him. The pause was brief, but noticeable. Caroline looked at him. Ethan looked at me. And suddenly I saw something interesting flicker behind his eyes. Calculation. Because Ethan knew something Caroline apparently hadn't considered yet. The original tickets hadn't been charged to their accounts. They had been charged to mine. Caroline crossed her arms. Fine, she said coldly. Then we'll just charge it ourselves. Of course, I replied. She pulled out her phone and began typing quickly. 30 seconds passed, then another. Her expression slowly shifted from irritation to confusion. Finally, she looked up again. The price is different now, she said. Yes, I said pleasantly. Last-minute business class seats tend to be expensive. Very expensive. And for the first time that morning, I noticed something remarkable. Caroline wasn't angry anymore. She was worried. Worry looks different on everyone. Some people get loud, others get quiet. Caroline became very still. She stared at the screen of her phone as if the numbers there might rearrange themselves if she waited long enough. The bright airport lights reflected faintly on the glass. How much is it? Ethan asked. She hesitated before answering. 4,600. Even he looked surprised at that. For one seat? He asked. Yes. Business class. Last minute. International departure in less than an hour. Airlines have a remarkable ability to turn urgency into luxury pricing. Ethan ran a hand across his jaw and gave a low whistle. Well, he said, forcing a light tone, that's steep. Caroline lifted her eyes toward me again. You knew this would happen. I shrugged slightly. Airlines can be unpredictable. Her gaze sharpened. You did this on purpose. Caroline, I said calmly, you told me business class only had 2 seats left. That's not what I meant. No? The frustration returned to her voice. You know exactly what I meant. Yes, I did. She meant that I should sit quietly in economy while they enjoyed champagne and wide seats at the front of the aircraft. She meant that I should be grateful simply to be included. She meant that my role in the trip was financial support, not comfort. Ethan cleared his throat. All right, he said. We'll figure it out. He took Caroline's phone and looked at the screen himself. His eyes moved quickly as he scrolled through the options. Economy seats were still available, many of them, but Caroline had already seen that too. I'm not flying economy, she said flatly. The words slipped out before she could stop them. For a moment, none of us spoke. The irony of the statement seemed to hover in the air between us like a delicate glass ornament. I watched Ethan carefully. He knew, not just about the price, about the situation. Because Ethan Whitmore understood numbers, and numbers told a very clear story. Without my card attached to the reservation, their family vacation suddenly looked very different. What about the hotel? Caroline asked him quietly. That question was not meant for me, but I heard it anyway. Ethan's shoulders tightened slightly. The hotel should still be fine, he said. Should. Such a flexible word. Caroline turned back to me. You said you're going home? That's correct. So you're just leaving? Yes. Her disbelief returned again. Mom, the entire trip is already arranged. Yes, I agreed. And you paid for it? Yes. Then why would you cancel everything now? I looked at her for a long moment. There are times when a person asks a question because they truly want the answer, and there are times when they ask because they cannot imagine the answer existing. This was the second kind. Caroline, I said quietly, do you remember something you told me at the counter? Her eyes narrowed slightly. What? You said not to make a scene. She frowned. Yes. I gave a small nod. And I haven't. Then I turned toward the terminal exit. Behind me, I heard Ethan say quietly, Evelyn, wait. But I kept walking. The automatic glass doors slid open as I approached. A rush of cool morning air spilled into the terminal, carrying the distant sound of traffic and taxi engines. Airports always feel different once you decide not to travel. The urgency disappears. The crowds stop mattering. And as I stepped outside into the sunlight, I felt something I hadn't expected when the day began. Relief. Because the truth was, this trip had never really been about Barcelona. It had been about something much closer to home. Outside the airport, the air felt cooler than I expected. It was early enough that the sun had not fully climbed above the buildings yet, and the light had that pale morning color that makes everything look slightly calmer than it really is. Taxis idled in a long yellow line, drivers leaning against doors or sipping coffee from paper cups while watching travelers rush toward the terminal. I stood there for a moment and simply breathed. It had been a long time since I had left a situation without explaining myself. For years, I had been the person who stayed, the one who smoothed things over, the one who paid the extra bill, solved the small crisis, or made the awkward conversation disappear. But today, I had done something unusual. I had walked away. My phone buzzed in my handbag. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Still, curiosity eventually won. When I opened the screen, I saw 3 missed calls from Caroline and 1 from Ethan. A message notification appeared a second later. Caroline. Mom, what are you doing? Another one arrived immediately. This is not funny. Then another. Call me right now. I slipped the phone back into my bag without answering. Across the pickup lane, a black town car pulled up to the curb, and a driver stepped out to open the trunk for a couple with matching suitcases. They looked excited, the way people often do when they're about to start a vacation. For a brief moment, I wondered if Caroline and Ethan were still inside trying to fix the problem. Probably. Airlines are excellent at selling solutions when travelers become desperate. My phone buzzed again. This time, I looked. Ethan, Evelyn, we need to talk. A second message followed almost instantly. The hotel reservation was under your card. Ah. So they had discovered the first complication. 3 months earlier, when I booked the hotel outside Barcelona, the concierge had been almost embarrassingly enthusiastic about the property. Old stone terraces overlooking the sea, olive trees lining the driveway, a restaurant that served saffron risotto with shaved truffles, and a dessert called crema catalana, prepared at the table with a small caramelizing torch. Caroline had loved the photos. Book the suite, she had told me over the phone. The one with the balcony. So I had. The suite, the transfers, the dinner reservations, even a small wine-tasting tour Caroline had mentioned wanting to try. Everything connected neatly to one very specific credit card. Mine. Another message appeared. Caroline again. Did you cancel the hotel too? I smiled slightly at the screen. Technically, I hadn't. Not yet. But airline reservations have an interesting relationship with hotel bookings. When one piece of a travel plan collapses, the rest often begins to wobble, especially when the person paying decides not to travel. I looked toward the road where taxis continued arriving and departing in steady rhythm. For the first time that morning, I felt absolutely certain of something. I was not getting on that plane. Not today. Perhaps not ever again with Caroline. My phone buzzed once more. This time it was a call from Lucas. I paused. Of everyone involved in this situation, he was the only person who had never asked me for anything unreasonable. I answered. "Hello, sweetheart." His voice sounded slightly confused. "Grandma? Mom said you were already boarding." I glanced back at the airport terminal behind me. The glass walls reflected the rising sunlight like a giant mirror. "No," I said gently. "I'm not boarding." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh." Lucas hesitated. "Did something happen?" I considered that question carefully. Inside the terminal, Caroline and Ethan were probably standing at the airline desk right now, discovering exactly how complicated travel becomes when someone else's wallet is no longer involved. "Yes," I said calmly. Something finally did. Lucas did not answer immediately. Through the phone, I could hear the faint background noise of a house, dishes clinking somewhere, a television murmuring in another room. It sounded peaceful, ordinary, very far away from the airport. "What happened?" he asked again. I considered the question while watching a plane lift slowly into the pale sky above the runway. Its engines roared for a moment, then softened as it climbed higher. "It's a long story," I said. Lucas hesitated. Mom sounded stressed. I allowed myself a quiet smile. That wouldn't surprise me. Another short pause followed. Lucas had always been careful with his words. Even as a child, he observed things before speaking, as if trying to understand the shape of a situation before stepping into it. "Grandma," he said slowly, "did something happen with the flight?" "Yes." "Did you miss it?" "No." "Did Mom?" That question made me laugh softly. "Possibly." Lucas exhaled quietly. "I knew something weird was going on," he admitted. "Oh?" "Mom called me earlier asking if I had your number saved." "That seems unlikely," I said dryly. "She's had my number since 1987. Lucas gave a small, embarrassed chuckle. "Yeah, I thought that too." A taxi driver nearby slammed the trunk of his car and waved for another passenger to approach. The morning traffic around the airport had started to build, engines humming steadily along the pickup lanes. "Grandma," Lucas said carefully, "did you and Mom argue?" "No." "You didn't?" "No." That part, at least, was true. Caroline had expected obedience, not a conversation. Lucas was quiet again for a moment. Then he said something that made my chest tighten slightly. "She does that sometimes." "What do you mean?" "With people," he said. "She decides things for them." I watched another aircraft taxi slowly toward the runway. That's a very polite way of describing it. Lucas hesitated again. "I shouldn't say this," he murmured. "You can say anything to me." There was a long pause on the line. Then Lucas spoke in a lower voice. "Last week at dinner," he said, "Mom told Ethan you were easy to manage as long as nobody challenged you." The words landed quietly, but they landed hard. "Did she?" I asked. "Yeah." Lucas sounded uncomfortable now. "I don't think she meant it the way it sounded." "Perhaps, but sometimes people mean exactly what their words reveal." "Lucas," I asked gently, "why are you telling me this?" He took a small breath. "Because I think she's really angry right now," he said. "And when she's angry, she sometimes forgets how things look from other people's side." That was a remarkably diplomatic way to describe his mother. "I appreciate your honesty," I told him. "I just didn't want you to think I agreed with her," he added quickly. That sentence stayed with me, because in a family full of carefully managed appearances, Lucas was the only person who seemed interested in something simple: fairness. Behind me, the airport doors slid open again. A wave of travelers stepped outside, dragging their luggage behind them. Among them, I suddenly recognized two familiar figures: Caroline and Ethan. They were moving quickly now, scanning the taxi line, clearly searching for someone. Searching for me. Lucas spoke again. "Grandma? Yes? Are you still at the airport?" I watched my daughter step onto the curb, her eyes darting across the rows of cars. "Yes," I said calmly. "I am." And Caroline had just spotted me. Caroline spotted me almost immediately. You can always tell when someone believes they are in control of a situation and suddenly realizes they are not. There is a very specific moment when the confidence disappears and urgency replaces it. That moment crossed her face as she stepped off the curb and started walking directly toward me. Fast. Ethan followed just behind her, already speaking quietly into his phone. Likely the airline desk. Or perhaps the hotel. Caroline didn't slow down until she was standing directly in front of me. "What did you do to the hotel?" No greeting. No hesitation. Just the question. I tilted my head slightly. "Good morning again, Caroline." "This isn't funny," she said sharply. "The hotel says our reservation requires the card holder to check in." "Yes," I said calmly. "That's generally how reservations work." Ethan lowered his phone slowly. "They won't release the suite without Evelyn present," he said to Caroline. She turned back to me. "So fix it." The confidence was trying to return to her voice now, but I could hear the small strain beneath it. "Call them," she continued. "Authorize the check-in." I studied her face for a moment. Caroline had always looked so composed. Even as a child, she hated appearing uncertain. At school recitals, she stood perfectly straight, while other children fidgeted. At university, she learned quickly that confidence could replace kindness in most social situations. But confidence, like credit, only works when someone continues backing it. "You should probably cancel the suite," I said gently. Ethan blinked. "Cancel it?" "Yes." Caroline stared at me. "Mom, the suite is nearly $3,000 a night." "I know." "You already paid the deposit." "Yes." "Then why would we cancel it?" I adjusted the strap of my handbag slightly. "Because I won't be there." For the first time since walking outside, Caroline's composure cracked completely. "This is insane," she said. "Is it?" "Yes," she snapped. "You're ruining the entire trip over a plane seat." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm correcting something." Ethan crossed his arms. "What exactly are you correcting?" he asked. I looked at both of them. "For years," I said quietly, "I've been paying for things you treat as entitlements." Neither of them spoke. "The condo," I continued. "Lucas's tuition. The investment you asked me to temporarily stabilize." Ethan shifted slightly at that last one. "And now this trip." Caroline shook her head. "You offered to help." "Yes," I said. "I did. And now you're punishing us for accepting?" "No." I met her eyes steadily. "I'm simply stopping." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else that morning. Cars rolled past. Taxi drivers shouted for passengers. Somewhere down the curb, someone laughed loudly into their phone. But the three of us stood perfectly still. Finally, Caroline spoke again. "So what happens now?" "That," I said, "is entirely up to you." This is the moment many people recognize. Not the insult, but the boundary. When Evelyn stops explaining and simply stops providing. Tell me honestly, if you were in her place right now, would you walk away? Or would you still try to fix everything? Caroline looked like she wanted to say something sharper, something crueler, but Ethan spoke first. We can still make the flight, he said quietly to her. She looked at him, then at me, then back toward the airport doors behind us. The boarding announcement echoed faintly through the glass. Final call approaching. And suddenly, the entire expensive vacation Caroline had carefully imagined was balancing on a single uncomfortable reality. They could still go, but this time, they would be paying for it themselves. Caroline was the first to look away. She turned toward the airport doors as another announcement echoed through the terminal speakers behind the glass. Final boarding for passengers traveling to Barcelona. The sentence drifted out through the sliding doors before they closed again. Caroline looked back at Ethan. Well? She asked. Ethan checked his watch, then glanced toward the terminal entrance, as if calculating distances in his head. Time to the gate. Time to security. Time to argue with airline staff. All things considered, the numbers were not encouraging. We still have about 20 minutes, he said. For what? Caroline snapped. For you to decide. Her jaw tightened. I'm not flying economy. That may not be optional now. She looked at him sharply. You're taking her side? I'm taking the airline's side, Ethan replied calmly, which is usually the side that gets paid. I watched the two of them with quiet interest. This was new. Caroline and Ethan normally moved like a synchronized pair in public. Elegant, confident, perfectly aligned. They attended charity events together, hosted dinners together, even disagreed politely when necessary. But now the smooth surface of that partnership was starting to crack, because suddenly there was a problem neither of them had expected. Money that wasn't mine. Caroline turned back toward me again. Are you really leaving? She asked. Yes. And that's it? Yes. No apology? She said. I considered that question. Then I smiled slightly. Would you like one? Her eyes narrowed. That's not funny. No, I agreed. It isn't. Behind us, a taxi pulled up and dropped off a family with 3 large suitcases and a stroller. The parents looked exhausted, the baby looked furious, and the entire group rushed toward the entrance as if the plane might leave without them. Travel has a way of revealing people's priorities very quickly. Caroline crossed her arms. You're being dramatic. That's possible. All of this over one comment. It wasn't one comment. She opened her mouth to argue, but I continued speaking. It was the assumption behind it. The words hung in the air between us. Caroline's expression hardened again. You always do this, she said. Do what? Make things bigger than they are. I shook my head slowly. No, Caroline. I've been making things smaller for years. That stopped her. Ethan glanced between us, clearly realizing the conversation was drifting somewhere deeper than he preferred. We're missing the point, he said. The flight leaves soon. He turned to Caroline. You can either buy the business seat now, take economy, or we walk away from the trip. Caroline looked at him in disbelief. Walk away? Yes. She gestured toward me. After everything she already paid for? Ethan didn't answer immediately, because he understood something Caroline was still struggling to accept. Everything she had paid for was no longer available. Caroline looked back at me one more time. You planned this. No, I said calmly. You created it. The airport doors opened again behind them. Another announcement echoed faintly. Gate closing in 15 minutes. Caroline looked toward the terminal, then back at Ethan, then back at me. For the first time in a very long time, my daughter looked like someone standing in a place she did not know how to navigate. And the uncomfortable truth was finally beginning to settle in. This trip had never been guaranteed. It had only ever been funded. Caroline hated losing control. I had known that about her since she was 12 years old and insisted on reorganizing the seating chart at her own birthday party because two girls from school refused to sit near each other. While the other parents tried to calm the situation, Caroline quietly moved the chairs, reassigned the tables, and announced the new arrangement like a small event planner. Even then, she believed problems could be managed. But this situation was different, because she couldn't rearrange the person holding the credit card. She looked from Ethan to the airport doors again. The automatic glass panels slid open and closed as travelers hurried inside. 15 minutes. Not much time to rebuild an expensive vacation. "You're not serious," she said to me again. "I am. This is childish." "That's one opinion." Ethan exhaled slowly and rubbed his temple. "Caroline," he said quietly, "we need to make a decision." She ignored him. "You've never done something like this before," she said to me. "No," I agreed. "And suddenly today you decide to punish us?" "I'm not punishing you." "Then what are you doing?" I looked at her carefully. "I'm stepping back." That phrase seemed to confuse her even more. From what? From being the solution to every inconvenience in your life. Caroline laughed once, sharply. "That's dramatic." "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "You make it sound like we're exploiting you?" Ethan shifted slightly beside her. He didn't say anything, but silence can be very revealing. "You asked for help," she continued, "and I accepted." "Yes." "You offered." "Yes. So don't pretend this is some great injustice." I studied her for a moment. Then I asked a question. "Caroline, when you told me to sit in economy today, did it occur to you that it might be insulting?" She frowned slightly. "It's a plane seat." That wasn't the question. She crossed her arms again. "You're 74, Mom," she said bluntly. "It's not like you care about business class." The honesty of that sentence surprised even her, because the moment it left her mouth, Ethan closed his eyes briefly, and I simply nodded. "That's very helpful," I said. "What is?" "Clarity." Caroline looked annoyed now. "You're twisting everything." "No." I gestured gently toward the airport behind her. "I'm just declining the arrangement." Ethan looked at his watch again. "We're out of time." Caroline turned toward him. "So, what do you want to do?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me, really looked at me for the first time that morning. Not as the polite mother-in-law who funded vacations. Not as the quiet woman who approved wire transfers when things went wrong. But as someone who had just changed the entire structure of the situation. "You're really going home," he said. "Yes." "And you're not authorizing the hotel?" "No." "And you're not fixing the flight?" "No." Another pause followed. Then Ethan nodded slowly. "All right." Caroline stared at him. "All right, what?" "We're not going to Barcelona." The words landed like a dropped glass. Caroline blinked. "What?" "We're not going," he repeated. "You can't be serious." "I am. We've planned this trip for months." "Yes," Ethan said calmly, "but apparently it wasn't actually ours." Caroline looked back at me with disbelief. "You're destroying the entire vacation." I shook my head gently. "No. I'm just no longer paying for it." The airport doors opened again behind them. Another boarding announcement echoed faintly. The flight to Barcelona was closing, and for the first time in years, Caroline Whitmore was standing in a situation where money couldn't quietly solve the problem. Because the money was walking away. For a moment, Caroline simply stared at Ethan as if she had misheard him. "We're not going?" she repeated. "No. You can't just decide that." "I didn't," he said calmly. "The situation decided it." She gestured sharply toward me. "She decided it." Ethan glanced at me again, then back at Caroline. "No," he said. "She just stopped fixing it." Caroline's face flushed slightly. "You're giving up because she's being dramatic." "I'm being realistic," he replied. Behind them, the airport doors slid open again, and a final boarding announcement drifted faintly outside. "Last call for passengers traveling to Barcelona." Caroline turned toward the terminal instinctively. The opportunity was still there, technically. But now it looked very different. One last-minute business class seat costing nearly $5,000. Or economy. The same economy seat she had expected me to accept without question. She looked back at Ethan. "You said we could rebook." "We could. So do it." "With what?" he asked quietly. That question lingered between them. Caroline frowned. "What do you mean with what?" "Our cards. So use them." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You know the limit on the Amex." Caroline blinked. "That's for emergencies." "This qualifies." She shook her head immediately. "No. I'm not putting $5,000 on a card because she's having some kind of emotional episode." I almost smiled at that phrase. Emotional episode. It had such a medical tone. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "There's also the hotel deposit." Caroline looked irritated. "That's already paid." "Yes, but if the cardholder doesn't check in?" The sentence trailed off. Caroline's eyes widened slightly. "You're saying they'll cancel the suite?" "They might." "And keep the deposit?" "They could." For the first time since this conversation started, Caroline looked genuinely unsettled. $3,000, she muttered. "She..." "Closer to 4 with taxes," Ethan replied. She looked at me again. "You're willing to lose that money just to make a point?" I shrugged lightly. "I've lost more trying to keep peace." That answer clearly frustrated her. "This is unbelievable," she said. But Ethan was no longer looking at me. He was looking at the ground, thinking. And then he said something that made Caroline turn sharply toward him. "There's another issue." "What issue?" "The investment account." Her expression tightened. "What about it?" Ethan hesitated. Then he spoke carefully. "The one Evelyn helped stabilize 2 years ago." Caroline looked confused. "What about it?" He glanced toward me briefly before continuing. "That account hasn't fully recovered." The silence that followed felt heavier than the airport noise around us. Caroline stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," Ethan said slowly, "we're not as liquid as you think right now." She blinked again. "You told me it was handled." "It is handled." "That's not what that sounds like." Ethan didn't respond immediately. And in that small pause, something became very clear. Caroline had not known the full truth. Not about the money. Not about how much of their comfortable life had quietly depended on mine. She looked between the two of us now. Between her husband and her mother. And for the first time that morning, Caroline Whitmore realized something she had never truly considered before. The person she had just dismissed at the airport counter might have been the only reason their life looked as stable as it did. Caroline looked at Ethan as if she were seeing him for the first time. "What do you mean we're not liquid?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now, but sharper. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully, which in itself was unusual. Normally, he spoke quickly, confidently, as if numbers and decisions belonged naturally to him. Now he looked cautious. The account took longer to recover than expected, he said. Caroline stared at him. You told me it was stable. It is stable. That's not the same thing. No, he admitted. The airport noise continued around us, rolling suitcases, taxi engines, distant announcements. But the three of us stood inside a very different conversation now. Caroline folded her arms tightly. How much? She asked. Ethan shifted slightly. Caroline. How much? He hesitated again. Then he said quietly, more than we planned. That answer clearly wasn't good enough. Her eyes moved slowly toward me. You knew about this? I shook my head. No. Ethan looked uncomfortable now. She didn't know the full details, he admitted. Full details? Caroline repeated. Yes. What full details? Another pause. Then Ethan said the one sentence he had clearly been avoiding. The initial loss was larger than I told you. Caroline blinked. How much larger? Ethan inhaled slowly. About 300. For a second, she didn't understand. Then the number settled. 300,000, she said. He nodded once. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Caroline looked stunned. You told me it was under control. It is under control. How exactly? Ethan glanced toward me again, and this time Caroline followed his gaze. Understanding arrived slowly, uncomfortably. You covered it, she said to me. I didn't answer immediately. Technically, I hadn't covered the entire amount, but I had provided enough capital at the right moment to prevent the situation from collapsing. Sometimes the difference between failure and recovery is simply time. Time someone else paid for. I helped, I said. Caroline looked back at Ethan. You said it was a temporary loan. It was. You told me the money was coming from the partnership reserve. Ethan didn't reply. That silence said everything. Caroline's voice dropped. So our stability, the condo, the school, all of that, she looked at me again, was because she kept supporting us. Ethan finally spoke. It wasn't like that, but Caroline shook her head slowly. No, she said. It was exactly like that. The realization was settling into her expression now. Not anger yet. Something heavier. Embarrassment. Because suddenly, the story she had been telling herself for years no longer made sense. The successful life. The careful social circle. The elegant dinners. All of it had been supported by something she had treated as ordinary. My willingness to help. Carolyn looked down at the pavement for a long moment. Then she said something very quietly. You never told me. I gave a small shrug. You never asked. Another silence stretched between us. Then Caroline lifted her eyes again. But this time, the sharp confidence she usually carried was gone. And when she spoke again, her voice sounded different. Smaller. Mom? Why didn't you say something before? I looked at the airport behind her. Planes leaving, passengers boarding, life continuing exactly as it always had. Then I answered her honestly. Because I thought you already knew. Caroline didn't respond right away. She was still looking at me, but her expression had changed again. The sharpness had faded, replaced by something far more uncertain. For years, she had moved through life with the quiet assumption that the structure around her was stable, that the ground beneath her decisions was solid. Now she was realizing that much of that ground had belonged to someone else. You thought I knew? She repeated. Yes. That we depended on you that much? I assumed you noticed? Caroline looked away again, toward the traffic lanes where taxis were still arriving and leaving in steady waves. I thought you just liked helping, she said. I did, but not like this. No, I said calmly. Not like this. Ethan remained quiet beside her. For once, the polished explanations he usually offered had disappeared. He understood numbers better than most people, and right now the numbers were telling a story he could not comfortably reframe. $300,000. A vacation that had just collapsed. A hotel suite that might vanish within hours. And a financial support system that had just walked toward the parking lot. Caroline finally spoke again. You should have said something. And what would you have done differently? She opened her mouth, then stopped. Because the honest answer was not obvious. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she sighed and rubbed her forehead. This whole situation is ridiculous, she muttered. Is it? I asked. Yes, she said, though her voice lacked the certainty it had earlier. She looked back at Ethan. We'll figure it out, she said. He nodded slowly. Yes. It was a simple exchange, but it carried a very different tone from the one they had arrived with. Before, their confidence had rested on invisible support. Now they were standing in a problem they actually had to solve themselves. Caroline turned toward me again. So that's it? Yes? You're leaving? Yes. And you're really not fixing any of this? No. Another long pause followed. Then she said something I hadn't heard from her in a very long time. All right. Just that. Not agreement, not acceptance, but recognition. She stepped back slightly, as if giving physical space to the decision that had already been made. Ethan glanced toward the terminal once more. Boarding's closed, he said quietly. Caroline didn't even look. The trip was already gone. Instead, she looked back at me. For years, our conversations had followed a familiar pattern. Request, hesitation, solution. Money moved quietly between accounts. Problems disappeared before they became visible. That pattern had ended this morning, and she finally understood it. You're serious about stopping, she said. Yes. Her eyes searched my face for something, anger, perhaps, or guilt. But she didn't find either, because the truth was simpler than that. I wasn't angry anymore. I was finished. Caroline gave a small nod. Then she turned to Ethan. Let's go, she said. Where? He asked. She looked toward the parking lot, the taxis, the road beyond the airport. Home, she replied. For a moment, none of us moved. Then I adjusted my handbag on my shoulder and stepped toward the waiting line of cars. Behind me, I heard their footsteps move in the opposite direction. For the first time in many years, we were no longer walking through the same plan. And strangely enough, that felt exactly right. For a few seconds after Caroline and Ethan walked away, I remained exactly where I was. The airport continued moving around me as if nothing unusual had happened. Cars arrived. Passengers rushed toward the sliding glass doors. A woman argued with a driver about luggage space, while a group of teenagers laughed loudly beside a taxi stand. Life rarely pauses just because a family argument has quietly rearranged itself. I watched Caroline and Ethan for a moment as they crossed the pickup lane. They weren't speaking to each other. Ethan had his hands in his coat pockets, walking slowly now. The confident stride he carried earlier, replaced by something more thoughtful. Caroline walked ahead of him, shoulders straight, but the sharp tension she carried earlier had softened. For the first time all morning, she looked like someone thinking instead of reacting. Perhaps that was a start. My phone buzzed gently in my handbag again. When I looked at the screen, I saw a new message from Lucas. Did everything calm down? I smiled faintly and typed back. Yes, it did. A few seconds later, 3 small dots appeared as he started writing again. Are you coming home? I looked once more toward the airport behind me. Through the tall glass walls, I could see passengers moving through security lines, luggage rolling behind them, faces full of anticipation. Some of them were heading toward vacations, others toward business meetings, and some, I imagined, were heading toward conversations they had been avoiding for far too long. Yes, I typed. I'm going home, Lucas replied almost instantly. Good. I think that's probably best. I slipped the phone back into my handbag and stepped toward the waiting taxis. A driver in a dark cap opened his trunk and nodded politely. Where to? He asked. Manhattan, I said. As the car pulled away from the curb, the airport slowly disappeared behind us in the rearview mirror. The runways stretched out like long silver lines across the morning light, and for a moment, I could see another plane lifting into the sky. People always talk about freedom as something dramatic, a big decision, a loud declaration. But sometimes it happens quietly, at an airport curb, with nothing more than a canceled ticket and the simple decision not to explain yourself anymore. For years, I had believed that helping my family meant smoothing every difficulty, absorbing every financial shock, and pretending that respect would eventually follow generosity. This morning, I learned something different. Respect doesn't grow out of endless support. Sometimes it begins the moment that support stops. The taxi merged into traffic, and the city skyline slowly rose ahead of us through the bright morning haze. For the first time in a very long while, I felt completely at peace. Well, sometimes the strongest move isn't arguing, it's simply walking away. What do you think? Was Evelyn right to do this? Or would you have handled it differently? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe.